Thank you. So I thank Marc Chaperon and Jean-Pierre Bourguignon, the scientific committee, the organizing committee, for this invitation. The relation between theory and experience is a delicate and original aspect in Thom's thinking. For Thom, catastrophe theory is not an experimental or predictive aim. Instead, it is meant to play an hermeneutic role with respect to known facts or observations. In this talk, I address this question from the point of view of the mediating role played by the epigenetic landscape in the evolution of Thom thinking from catastrophe theory to semiophysics. The epigenetic landscape is a set of images that has been introduced by Conrad Hall Waddington, an embryologist, theoretical biologist, and also great experimenter, starting from the 1940s. And this set of images that we will see is intended to grasp the Waddington understandings of the process of embryological development, namely cellular differentiation. So this is the first image in which we see a river flowing toward the sea with different channels. But we go directly to a second, much more immediate, I think, image, which is composed by a hilly surface with a ball ready to run downhill, and the surface represents the fertilized egg. The pathways taken by the ball represent development pathways from the egg to particular tissues or organs. And what it is important for this mental image is that it also carries several concepts which are very important for Waddington and that Thom retained. For example, the notion of cryod. It is a neologism that Waddington introduced to indicate these pathways, and he wanted to stress that they are necessary pathway for development. And along these pathways there is canalization that for Waddington is an essential property of development, in the sense that the ball running down stays on track as the organism stays on track during development despite perturbations. If the perturbations are too big or too disturbing, we can imagine that the ball or the organism does not stay on track, but in that case it jumps to another channel. So development is also discrete. There are different discrete final states. And along these cryods, these channels, there is a property, particular property, another Waddington neologism, homeoresis, which is the property of stability along a channel, along a cryod, which is a dynamic stability, not a stability towards a final state. There is also an underlying part of the epigenetic landscape that represents the system of interactions between the genes modeling the landscape, the genes and all the interaction between the genes. This is extremely important, this holistic vision that Waddington expresses through these images. Well, I said that this set of images can be seen as playing a mediating role with respect to possible experience. And Thom establishes a link with these images and the notions associated to the images, notably cryod and morphogenetic field, through the idea the notion, mathematical notion of structural stability, which is for Thom the natural attribute of every identifiable form that we can observe, in fact. And the idea, qualitative, is that a function is structurally stable if for a small enough perturbation of the function, the perturbed function has the same topological properties of the previous one. What I want to stress here is that the idea of, in a sense, trying and guaranteeing a relation with possible observable systems is part of the notion, even at of structural stability, even at the origin. In fact, this property has been introduced in the history of dynamical system by Andronov and his school with this question on mind: what properties must possess a mathematical model in order to correspond to a physical system? And for Waddington, for Thom, this is really an essential feature that take place in his translation in mathematical terms of a morphogenetic field. To him, a morphogenetic field on an open domain U of the space-time is based on the existence of a universal model of which the considered process is a copy. Such a process is in fact structurally stable. Its development is in accordance with the model given a priori, says Thom. What it is interesting is that in his seminal founding paper, Catastrophe theory, Thom writes down a set of equations starting from a particular example, which is given by Max Delbrück, and which is a model for a biochemical interpretation of cellular differentiation, the problem, in fact, that Waddington had in mind, as we saw. And in this model, in fact, Delbrück does not write equation. There is only a diagram that you see, but the idea is that the diagram represents the cell and enzymatic reactions that happen into the cell, and the idea is that the enzymatic reactions are not independent. There are cross reactions between different enzymatic reactions, and this cross reaction allow Delbrück to consider that in this system there are possible different steady states, namely 3, in fact, and this is a translation because the original is in French. Many systems in flow equilibrium are capable of several different equilibria under identical conditions. They can move from one equilibrium state to another under the influence of transient perturbations. This is the example described Thom, and Thom, starting from this example, in his seminal paper In théorie dynamique de la morphogenèse, writes down the equation. So he considers K chemical substances S of a certain concentration C, and he writes down a differential law for the variation of the concentrations. Then he localizes these equations on the domain U on a system of coordinates X, writing down equations which are, in fact, which contain a partial differential equation, which contain a first term, which is a reaction term, and the second term, which is a diffusion term. But Thom, for consideration of structural stability, consider that the diffusion term can be neglected with respect to the reaction term. What it is very interesting, and it has been a great pleasure to have the possibility of discuss this aspect with Jean Petitot while preparing the commentaries for the œuvre complète de René Thom, is that this system is analogous to the equation of reaction diffusion equation that Turing introduces in his work on morphogenesis, the 1952 papers on the chemical basis of morphogenesis. I think that Jean will give the details of this comparison mathematically and theoretically. What I want to stress here, following the line of following Waddington landscapes, in fact, is that Waddington has been highly influential for Turing too. Because in this paper, The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis, Turing was looking at this onset of instability. And in fact, the role of equilibria and change of equilibria during development was really one of the topics that Waddington developed with his friends in theoretical biology already since the 30s. So Turing knew this work, and look at this quotation. Unstable equilibrium is not, of course, a condition which occurs very naturally. It usually requires some rather artificial interference, such as placing a marble on the top of a dome, etc. I underlined this because as a hidden image of these rolling marbles that we find also in Turing. So let's come back to our thread of the speech concerning the dialogue between Thom and Waddington. Thom wrote this seminal paper for the Symposia Towards a Theoretical Biology, edited by Waddington. And following the paper, there has been a very interesting correspondence between Thom and Waddington. Then Thom published, in fact, at the end of his paper in the book in French, Modèle mathématique de la morphogenèse. And these letters are very known. They testify of, at the beginning, some misunderstandings, and then they found maybe an agreement. But in any case, they debated about the difference between alternative steady states and time-extended cryods. And Waddington wanted to stress that homeoresis, his notion, is different, is something different with respect to homeostasis, and that the variable time is not taken enough into account from his point of view of biologist, from the mathematical perspective carried on by René Thom. In any case, they found an agreement on cryod as an attractor of biochemical kinetics tangent to the point under consideration. But maybe we can remind that this question of the time variable on the landscapes is represented as by the steepness of the landscape, maybe. And and we will see, I will come back to this idea later. Now I want only to underline that this agreement has been stable and that the two scientists continue to refer one to another. And Waddington in 1975, for example, very explicitly acknowledged that cryods can be explained in terms of catastrophe theory, and that Thom catastrophe are the switches between the cryods. So it is a very long quotation. I am afraid I have not the time to read all the quotation, but it is also interesting that to consider that Waddington thought there is ideas on process biology coming from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead could be expressed through Thom theory. So it is a great acknowledgement at the end of almost the end of Waddington's life. I want to stress another, I will give you the references if you want to read all the quotation. I want to stress another point of this dialogue between the two scientists, that also Thom has always been very, he paid attention to Waddington's remarks. And in fact, at a certain point, he wrote in 1989 an article containing an inventory of Waddington concepts. And about canalization, he writes, canalization describes any kind of process whose temporal evolution is buffered against external perturbations. There is apparently no strict mathematical equivalent to this concept, as the classical structural stability is of global topological nature, whereas canalization has a metric and local character. Let's also keep in mind this remark for the second part of the talk. For this first part, I want only to conclude on this first part, I want only to show these pictures that come from another letter between the two scientists, a letter from Thom to Waddington of December 1967, that Thom did not publish in the set of the published letter of the correspondence, but in fact he used the picture in an article of 1969 on topology. That is in the Œuvre complète. It is he called it in the article the hydraulic model. What I want to stress here is that, so Thom asked a friend of him, Monsieur Froissart, a physicist from Saclay, to make a plaster model of the epigenetic landscape, on the other sense, in the sense that here we have a potential well and not a hill. And, but of course, here there is a little bit this difference. We don't have the general steepness, we have a potential well. In any case, what it is interesting for us is that through a composition of two landscapes and the idea of pouring water from a landscape to another, Waddington thinks, and there is a long description in the letter, but we cannot stay on this now, but he thinks of that one could pass from the idea of modeling development to the idea of modeling reproduction. And this is the diagram that accompanies the letter. We will come back also to this idea later. Now, I would like to consider a little bit the presence, even if less explicit presence of notion, Waddingtonian notion and images in the development, I should say maybe the evolution of Thom thinking concerning semiophysics, la physique du sens, a neologism that Thom, for creating which Thom has been inspired by physique du sens, the expression physique du sens that Jean Petitot used in his work, if I am right, morphogenesis du sens. And with this project, Semiophysics, Thom wants to insert himself in the tradition of natural philosophy, and he wants to develop a very general theory of intelligibility, interested on significant forms. For developing this, he introduces the notion of salient forms or salience and pregnant form of pregnancies. And well, a salient form is defined as any experienced form clearly separate from the continuous background against which it stands out. Pregnancies are non-localized entities emitted and received by salient forms. Thom precizes that they carry a biological significance. Among these are the forms of prey and the hungry predator, of the predator for its prey, of a sexual partner at the appropriate time. The recognition of these forms give rise to a very ample reaction in the subject, the freeing of hormones, emotive excitement and behavior designed to attract or repulse the inductive form. And again, when a salient form seizes a pregnancy, it is invaded by this pregnancy and consequently undergoes transformations in its inner state, which can in turn produce outward manifestations in its form. We call these figurative effects. What I want to highlight is that in semiophysics, describing a pregnancy, a biological pregnancy, Thom explicitly writes that pregnancy can be thought as a potential well in the sense of a Waddington's landscape. But also in writings of Thom, also not only in semiophysics but other writings of this period, but also in semiophysics, Thom also speaks of physical or objective pregnancies, which are structurally stable forms. And he says that fields in physics are the paradigm of these objective pregnancies in modern science. He speaks of biological or subjective pregnancies in case in which there is an involvement of the own body of the observer. And I want to stress and consider for a moment this analogy, qualitative analogy that we find in semiophysics between objective pregnancy, that is to Gedanken experiment, mental experimentation, as subjective pregnancies is to real affective experience. Thom is very quickly, passes very quickly on this, to me, very interesting analogy. And he says, attention, it is an Aristotelian analogy, not mathematical. And so let's consider a little bit this analogy. First of all, in fact, it is a four terms analogy, a comparison of two relations and not of two objects. How to consider questions that can be opened by this analogy? First of all, what is the status of this Aristotelian analogy in Thom's Semiophysics and more in general in Thom's work? Also another question that I think it is important, what is more in general the status of analogy inside catastrophe theory and René Thom's work? And in turn, has catastrophe theory something to say with respect to the question of analogy in contemporary science? And in order to try and answer a little bit to this question, I found useful to consider how in contemporary philosophy of science is analogy considered, analogy for referred to science. And here I took, for example, this quotation from one of the great experts on the study of analogies and analogical reasoning in science, which is Paul Barta, who wrote the item Analogy and Analogical Reasoning for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And we can see that an analogy is defined by Paul Barta is a comparison between two objects or system of objects that highlights respects in which they are thought to be similar. And this definition, in fact, we found this definition in the tradition, a little bit logicist tradition of treating analogy, also in the work of another expert of analogy in physics, Mary Hess, that Barta works a lot in continuity with Mary Hess. We found the same kind of definition, and also in the textbooks of logic in the chapter of analogy. Analogy very often is presented, reasoning in terms of similarities between two objects. Of course, everyone in generally acknowledges that Aristotle has been a founding thinker for the study of analogy. In particular, Méliès studied Aristotle theory of analogy, but people think that even if in Aristotle there is this proportional four terms analogy for considering topics in modern science, it is important this analogy as comparison between two objects. So first, originality. I thought, look, Thom wants to keep the proportional four terms analogy. Secondly, well, in general, this approach to analogy is accompanied by the idea that there is analogical reasoning and analogical arguments, and an analogical argument is considered an explicit representation of a form of analogical reasoning that cites accepted similarities between two systems to support the conclusion that some further similarities exist. So, another question is treated in this tradition of contemporary tradition in philosophy of science concerning analogy in science. Author, at least Hesse and Barta, distinguish between two kinds of analogies: formal analogies and material analogies. Formal analogies for Hesse are two domains that both are interpretations of the same formal theory. And Barta generalizes a little bit this definition, saying that where even cases where there is a common mathematical structure between models for two systems can be considered to present formal analogies. In particular, two features are formally similar if they occupy corresponding positions in formally analog theories. Of course, even if they are interested in what they call material analogy, that for them is based on pre-theoretical similarities, of course, if one is interested in physics, in the development of physics, of course, it is evident that formal analogies played an extreme important role. So one question could be, is catastrophe theory a theory that provides criteria to establish formal analogies? And I think that we could answer very simply yes, in the sense that it provides a means of categorizing. For this talk, based on the images of epigenetic landscape, I would like to consider the first example of this transition from the domain of embryology to the domain of reproduction, that for Thom was possible through these material models, even if they are material models, but I think that they grasp an idea of formal analogy, because we pass from one content to another content through the same form, in fact. And this, I think, is in general the spirit through which we can consider, and Thom wrote beautiful pages on this in Parabole Catastrophe, that elementary catastrophe theory can be seen as a means towards a categorization, and he gives examples in linguistic. But more in general, if I may, I suggest that we could consider in the field of dynamical systems, how to say, I want not to use applied, but used to in physics. In particular, if we consider the field of the transition to turbulence, and we know that the seminars of René Thom given here have been so important for Ruel in order to develop his idea on the transition to turbulence. And if we take the notion of scenario of chaos transition, defined by Ekman as a generic sequence of bifurcation of a one-parameter family of dynamical systems under the variation of a control parameter. Maybe we can see also in this more generalized case through dynamical systems a possibility of establishing analogies between family of flows, physical flows or even simulated flows. So, of course, second point of originality of René Thom, I don't mean the particular proportional analogy that we are discussing, but more in general, the theoretical status of René Thom's proposition as this originality with respect a theory of analogy in contemporary science, since it provides a means to think to analogy which has not been very studied, not at all, maybe in literature, and another great originality. But let's come to the first question of this proportional analogy we started for. Should we think to catastrophe theory and I question mark and semiophysics as a formal theory of analogy, as only a formal theory of analogy, always in parabole Catastrophe, and I am sorry if I did not translate this quotation, Thom says, une fois formalisé, c'est-à-dire rapporté à un logos, une analogie est nécessairement vraie, mais à ces points, on en tire bien peu de choses, si ce n'est la possibilité de métaphores plus ou moins poétiques. Mais si, en revanche, l'analogie ne peut pas être formalisée, elle est nécessairement conjecturale et audacieuse. Raison pour laquelle, justement, elle peut amener à des conséquences nouvelles et imprévues. On n'a cependant aucune certitude quant au fonctionnement de l'analogie. Ou bien elle est vraie et alors elle s'avère stérile, ou bien elle est audacieuse et alors elle peut être féconde. So, if we take seriously this quotation, we can ask, audacious analogies have only a heuristic role that everybody acknowledges to analogy. Everybody, even people that don't like analogy, are obliged to recognize that analogy has an heuristic role. But so, do they have only this role, or in this sense, are they meant to be formalized once this role has been played, or there is something that resists? And only a consideration in the particular case here below, the analogy, since we are interested here in the mediation role between theory and experience, here the mediation is played between the physical or objective domain, with Thom's word, with respect the biological or subjective one. So it is a kind of bridge that Thom tries to establish, which is different from passing from a scientific domain, for example, embryological development, to the scientific domain of reproduction. It is another kind of bridge, it is my suggestion. And in order to try a little bit to go toward a conclusion with this question on mind, in idea is, let's try and track till the end the landscape, the epigenetic landscape that was important for Thom during the evolution of his thinking. In the same paper in which he inventorizes Waddington's notion, he considers the epigenetic landscape. And he asks this rhetoric question: is the epigenetic landscape fixed once for all, or it is flexible under external stress? Thom uses here the term flexible, but I think that one could speak in biological terms of plastic, in fact. And remember, Thom asked this question, rhetoric. Of course, he thinks that the landscape can change under external stress. And remember that also he acknowledged that canalization is not properly grasped through the mathematical notion of structural stability. With these two considerations, I suggest to consider how Waddington links this idea of canalization as a property, essential property of development, with genetic assimilation, a process, a phenomenon that is studied experimentally through experience of artificial selection, and that can be defined as a process by which a phenotype originally produced in response to an environmental condition, for example, an external stress, for example, a thermal shock or other things, later becomes genetically encoded via artificial or natural selection. What it is very interesting in Waddington's approach is that he depicts genetic assimilation as a modification of the landscape as a whole, not the effect of one gene, for example, one gene mutation, but a landscape as a whole. So a plasticity of the landscape itself. And in fact, Thom had in mind when he asked, is the epigenetic landscape flexible? Yes, he had in mind this experience by Waddington. So there is this. Since we said we can really now it is time to conclude. Since we saw that in the Aristotelian, not mathematical, said Thom, analogies that we considered, but Aristotelian, we said that the biological pregnancy was implied, and that for Thom it is a Waddington landscape. I would like to conclude with these considerations. In the first part of the talk, we considered structural stability as a mathematical notion coming from dynamical system theory, as offering a link with notions associated to the epigenetic landscape, and as bridging mathematical models and several domains of scientific experience. And also I suggested the idea that this theoretical domain offers, in fact, an original interesting way of providing criteria for establishing formal analogies in contemporary science, and it is interesting. Could be interesting for contemporary philosophy of science. But in the second part, following the epigenetic landscape itself, involved in proportional qualitative analogies, we assisted here to the bridge between heterogeneous domain, the objective one with the subjective one of, if we want, external experience with internal experience, something that Thom had in mind. And let us remember that the epigenetic landscape itself possesses this property of plasticity, difficult to express mathematically. So this is my conclusion. I think that morphological and analogical thinking in Thom is extremely thought-provoking, not only for theoretical biology and also biosemiotics, but also for contemporary philosophy of science. Thank you.
questions or remarks?
I have two questions about vocabulary. What do you mean by homeoresis and by creod?
Yes, so we can come back to the images. These are two neologisms that Waddington introduced. So the creod, a creod intended as a necessary path of development is one of these channels, one of these pathways that you see that the ball can take. And the other is homeoresis. Yes. Okay, so creod, why necessary? Because for Waddington, he writes a lot of, he explains very clearly this. For Waddington, development is discrete. The organism goes towards some certain final states. And if there are problems like in teratology, for example, there is like a jump into another creod. Homeoresis is another neologism, the same flow, to characterize the properties of developmental stability, which is a stability that one should consider along a pathway and not only considering the final state. And for Waddington, there is a difference between this notion of stability along a pathway with respect to the stability that one can say here in this diagram by the book, which is a diagram intended to defend the idea that thanks to cross reactions in enzymatic reaction, we can have several different steady states. For Waddington, homeoresis is really a neologism that wants to distinguish in itself with respect to homeostasis.
Thank you.
I just have a remark, because for many of these debates came from interpretation of Aristotle and development from Aristotle. But there was another moment in philosophy during 2 centuries or 3 where people do that, starting with Thomas d'Aquin.
Yes.
And then you have Dunscott, and then you have Occam to schematize. And it's very remarkable that the debate was on how you conjugate reality outside the mind and construction in the mind in the establishment of knowledge. And this notion, for example, of formality appears at some moment very crucially in the work of Dunscott, especially because he tells that, in some sense, it's true that in reality nothing is organized. You have only individuals, no universal, and only in the mind you construct universal as a catastrophe or models. But still, we are able, with our mind, to distinguish between things that we can recognize in the reality. And it was very interesting that the answer of Occam says that no, it's not possible to do that because in reality nothing can be really organized, but about relation, yes. So it was not really for him in Aristotle, but he says that what we can do is with the mind internalize real relations into universal relations. So for me it's very strange that all the elements are here, but people at that time were conscious that they don't translate Aristotle. They construct something else from Aristotle.
Thank you for your remark, because in fact, working on analogy, the medieval theory of analogy is extremely important, difficult, in fact, but extremely important. And I noticed, in fact, that how it has a little bit maybe been left from this line contemporary philosophy of science concerning analogy. They not only left maybe a part of the Aristotelian analogy on the side, but even worse it was maybe for this medieval theory of analogy, and in particular, it is a difficult topic, but I'm trying to work on that. There is an Italian philosopher, Enzo Melandri, who wrote an important work on analogy, and he pays attention to attributive analogy coming from the medieval tradition, but thought with it is a book of 68, but thought in reference to the science of his time, so actualized.
But at that time, for this debate, for the contribution to knowledge of the mind and the outer world, in fact, they don't speak really of analogy, because analogy was mostly dedicated to the problem of being.
Yes.
So that's the two problems are, in some sense, two different. Of course, they are related. Okay? So they were careful to not speak of analogy about knowledge.
Yes, they consider that it was absolutely two different problems. But do we? The question that Melandri asked is: could attributive analogy give something of interest if we want to consider today how analogy works? But of course, for them it was a difficult chapter. Thank you.
Questions? Okay, then thank the speaker again.